America's first multimillionaire was a German immigrant by the name of John Jacob Astor. Born in the mid 18th century, by the time of his death 8 decades later, his net worth would be an estimated 0.9% of US GDP, or the equivalent of having a $200 billion fortune today. Johann Jacob Astor was born in Waldorf in the year 1763 in the present German state of Baden-Württemberg. His father was a butcher, so the young Johann was used to blood, sweat, tears, and most importantly, pungent smells. This ability of tolerating horrible smells would prove lucrative in later years. Like many of the people of his era, he began his adulthood early, moving to London at 16 to work as a musical instrument salesman for his elder brother George. It was here that he learned English and anglicized his name to John Jacob. The music business is what took him to America, where he immigrated to in 1783 at the ripe age of 20 to sell flutes and piano fortes. His voyage cost him all of £5. Arriving in New York, John linked up with his older brother, Henry, who had continued their father's trade as a butcher. He would later become a noted horse enthusiast and wealthy in his own accord. In these early years, John gained his footing trying multiple trades, but maintaining a keen eye on one product in particular: furs. Fur was an important commodity in the pre-polyester era for two key reasons. One, for colder climates, it was the only fabric that could keep people reasonably warm. And two, in much of Europe, beavers, arguably the best animal fur to use as an average person, had been hunted to near extinction. Beaver pelts acquired in North America could be sold in Europe for a markup of up to 800 to 900%. Very lucrative. Before he turned 25, John Jacob set forth into the wilderness to build his fortune in the fur trade. Traveling through modern-day upstate New York and Canada, Astor traded goods like liquor, tobacco, cloth, and jewelry with indigenous peoples. In return, he accepted a wide array of pelts like otter, muskrat, and of course, beaver. This was a smelly, bloody business, one that John Jacob's experience in a butcher shop had prepared him for, and he was good at it. It was on these early escapades that John Jacob picked up some indigenous languages like Oneida, Seneca, and Mohawk. This gave him an advantage against other traders where he was able to negotiate preferable rates and build stronger relationships. Beyond his business with the various indigenous peoples, Astor also had another important relationship early in his career: Sarah Todd. Daughter of Mrs. Todd, the operator of a small boarding house, Astor lived in New York. Sarah Todd proved to be an instrumental asset to the Astor family's success through the decades. She bore 8 children, 5 of whom served into adulthood. It was her strength that kept the family together when John Jacob would travel for months at a time to acquire inventory. She was a brilliant homemaker, yes, but also a sharp business mind. Born into an entrepreneurial family, her mother was an innkeeper after all, Sarah quickly gained an expertise at assessing the quality and value of furs. Historians also point to Sarah as the originator of the idea to invest in New York real estate. Her family had been residents of New York for decades, well before John Jacob's arrival. They had seen the city erupt in size, and in front of their eyes, they wanted to cash in. She also brought much-needed capital to John Jacob's business effort. Marrying in 1785, her $300 dowry enabled the opening of a storefront where flutes, pianos, furs, and other things were sold. This establishment generated significant income for the Astor Empire, which it needed greatly to expand. John Jacob's fortunes really turned in 1794. Prior to that, Great Britain heavily taxed Canadian pelts. They had to travel to London, be taxed, then shipped back to New York. Despite the circuitous global travel, the profit from the business was still huge. In 1794, however, with the Jay Treaty, the United States was able to establish a trade relationship directly with the British Empire, allowing the direct export of furs from Canada to New York. The added speed of acquiring inventory combined with lesser taxation skyrocketed the Astor fortune. It was at this point that John Jacob stopped venturing into the wilderness himself, instead employing agents across the continent, significantly expanding his footprint, making his acquired capital work for him. In 1798, at the age of 35, he was worth $250,000, or roughly $4 million today. To put it into perspective, an average family could easily operate for an entire year for under $1,000. Well, under. What set Astor apart from his competitors was his use of liquor. Other trading posts, like those set up by the American government, operated without a significant profit motive, and most importantly, they did not trade in alcohol. The Astor's organization, which was reorganized as the American Fur Company in 1808, did the opposite. They undercut prices and use addicted indigenous peoples to their advantage, sometimes selling a handle of whiskey for as much as $25, a huge sum in the 19th century. Astor also used the tools of modern finance to enrich his business. He allowed indigenous tribes to trade on credit, racking up huge debts in his favor. By becoming the sole source for goods at the far-flung outposts, the American Fur Company was able to sell essential goods at grossly inflated prices. This affected both indigenous peoples and company employees. These strategies enabled the American Fur Company to establish a monopoly along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, creating a juggernaut corporation much to the enrichment of the Astor family. Beyond the acquisition of furs, Astor had a monopoly in America on trade with the British East India Company, which allowed him to use their ports. This enabled trade with Asia and in particular China. In a city like New York, with a growing elite class, there was an immense appetite for rich Asian luxuries in silk, tea, and spices. Astor likely engaged in the opium trade as well, a hugely successful venture at the time. He also held monopolies in sandalwood and was the only American able to break the blockade caused by the War of 1812. See, Astor employed a Chinese person who had a death in his family back home. Using this as leverage, Astor asked for special permission to bypass the blockade to take the employee home for the funeral. On the ship, however, Astor retained inventory, and on the way back, he had even more from his trade in China. As he was the only person in America able to bypass the blockade, it was another monopoly he used to his advantage. This single trade is estimated to have earned John Jacob $100,000. As capable as he was in the fur and international commodities business, building one fortune is impressive. What sets Astor apart and other world beaters like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller is their ability to sense shifting winds and reposition themselves in what at first appears like a lesser position, but over years and often decades becomes a differentiator and often accelerator in their legacy. For Astor, the decision occurred in 1834 when he exited the fur trading business with some $2 million and entered into his next venture, real estate. Astor was an early proponent of real estate investing. He started in the late 18th century when he first started accruing excess capital. Due to the importance of sea channels and ports to his business, he naturally gravitated to these properties. He quickly became something of a release valve for land-rich, cash-poor people down on their luck. One such individual was Aaron Burr, the former Vice President of the United States. Burr was in debt and secured a loan from Astor with 241 plots of property in Manhattan as collateral. This land would later become Greenwich Village. Another family, the Edens, fell into need for cash. Astor again stepped in. Their farmland became what is today Times Square. Astor never developed his properties, instead renting the land on long-term leases to sub-landlords. These sub-landlords would build dwellings on the properties. The rent would scale higher yearly, giving an incentive for sub-landlords to build dense, slum-like housing. When the lease expired, the Astors would swoop in and take their land back, with the building on it reverted back to Astor ownership. When you combine the mass immigration from the early 1800s, with the rate of immigration jumping from 60,000 immigrants in the 1820s to 140,000 in the 1830s to 600,000 in the 1840s, this huge jump in new people arriving by boat and needing a cheap place to stay meant the value of Astor property exploded. It was this business that earned the Astor family the title, the Landlords of New York. By 1840, they were charging $175 per lot, a nearly 111% increase over rates charged in the 1810s, which was approximately $50 for the same lot. Thus, the shrewd acquisition of previously worthless farmland proved incredibly lucrative for the Astors, with real estate becoming the primary vehicle for Astors and future generations to generate income. John Jacob Astor died in 1848 at the age of 84. His last few years in retirement were hard, with Astor displaying significant physical and cognitive decline. Upon his death, Astor left a massive fortune. While there was some disagreement in 1848, most historians now agree that his estate was likely worth around $25 million, the equivalent of roughly $975 million today. In 1848, this was equivalent to 0.9% of the US GDP. Not bad for someone who arrived to the country on a £5 boat ticket. Upon John Jacob's death, his second-born son, William Backhouse Astor Sr., became the richest man in America. Not a surprise. John Jacob Astor built a monumental business empire which continued to fund his family for generations after his death. With his opportune acquisition of real estate, the Astors came to be owners of much of modern-day New York City, with some estimates putting at 3% of the city. The influence of the Astor family permeated into the 20th century, with members of the family contributing in the realm of business, sport, and of course, philanthropy. Members were Olympians, politicians, and like their predecessor, though less successful, business tycoons. The family also used their wealth to go international. In England, a branch of the Astor family set down their own roots. William Waldorf-Astor left the United States in the late 1800s. In 1899, he became a British subject, and in 1916, he was made a baron. In 1917, he was further elevated to the Viscount Astor for his contributions to the British war efforts. Other notable contributions from the Viscount Astors include his daughter-in-law, wife of the second Viscount. She became the first woman elected as a member of Parliament, Nancy Astor. She was an MP from 1919 to 1945. The family also received another title, given to William Waldorf's youngest son, Lieutenant Colonel John Jacob Astor, who became the first Baron Astor of Havre in the 1950s for his efforts in politics. Both titles remain active to this day. The Astor's cultural footprint can also be felt today in New York. For example, there is the Astor Library, now part of the New York Public Library. There is the Waldorf-Astoria Hotel, Astor Row, Astor Court, Astor Place, Astor Avenue, and Astoria in Queens, which also takes their name from the family. Other places bearing the Astor name include Astor Street in Wisconsin, the football club FC Astoria Waldorf in Germany, not to mention towns across the United States, including Florida, Iowa, Kansas, and Georgia with the name Astor, and Astoria in states like Oregon, Missouri, New York, and Illinois. This does not include the numerous efforts that the Astors paid for but did not have their name attached to. For example, the Astors funded Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's expedition to Everest, which culminated in the first successful summit of the mountain. John Jacob Astor was a pioneering businessman and the very archetype for the eventual branding of America as the land of opportunity. He was a textbook example of work ethic, which he absolutely used to get his start as he traversed the American wilderness. His story cannot be told without his many partners. First, the many indigenous people his American fur company traded with and often took advantage of. Second, and equally important, was his wife and partner, Sarah Todd, a keen businesswoman with connections her husband did not have, an excellent fur evaluator, mother, and of course, real estate mind. Astor reportedly called her the best business partner any man ever had. She was instrumental in raising the next generation of Astors who continued expanding the wealth and enhancing the cultural legacy of the family. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to High Level History. Thank you.